Thank you very much for inviting me to talk again. You obviously must be desperate. So you've had an introduction. I was in the Royal Navy for 23 years as a doctor and psychiatrist. So I spent a bit of time bobbing around the ocean myself. Since then, I work at King's College London, and I run a company called March on Stress. And I'm really interested in occupational mental health across the board. So the main reason I think I've been asked to speak today is we carried out a systematic review on the mental health of people who serve at sea. Now, for those of you who aren't too much into science, a systematic review is where you try and look at all the evidence, you gather it together, and then you use a quality rating scale to say what's good evidence and what's not so good. And then hopefully the recommendations or main findings that come out are based more on the good evidence than they are on the evidence that's not quite so good. And you can see here, without going through all the tables, we looked at lots and lots of papers in order to get down to 42 papers, which we derived most of our recommendations for. And those 42 papers covered 63 different studies. And these are there's lots of discussion about, what are the risk factors. As far as we know, and this is 3 years old now, so things might have changed just a little bit. This is the best evidence we have about what the main risk factors are for having mental health difficulties if you're in the maritime industry. You can read them as well as me reading them out. Some of them, of course, you can't change. You can't change if someone's young, not much more. You decide you're only going to recruit people over the age of 45 or something. Doesn't make any sense. But some of the things there, such as poor sleep, such as feeling unsafe, just the presentation you just heard as an example, you can do things about. And then what I'm going to try and do is to just run through a few of the recommendations that fall out from this, that I think that there are practical things that can be done. And we often, in this sense, talk about static risk factors, such as your gender or such as your age, and then modifiable risk factors. And obviously, we should concentrate more on the ones that are modifiable. So one of the recommendations that falls out is training of staff, particularly supervisors, how to recognise mental health problems. Now, in any system, whether it's maritime, whether it's emergency services or military, you have a hierarchy. And actually, the most influential people in the hierarchy aren't the people at the top. You might think they are, but they're not. It's actually the person who's your one-up. So your supervisor, whoever that supervisor is, who day-to-day has an impact upon your schedule and what you do. And so what we know is actually, if we can... if we can train up supervisors to feel confident to speak about mental health issues, that makes a dramatic impact. The World Health Organization in 2022 developed a huge guidance document. If you can't sleep, a couple of pages, that's really effective, much more effective than sleeping tablets. It's a really thick document. But the best evidence overall in any workplace is training up junior supervisors to have what we call a psychologically savvy chat. The US military have this great phrase: is you do a check-up from the neck up. So it's being able to talk about mental health. So this is data from some military personnel some years ago who were in Afghanistan. This is looking at troops who have probably got post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. It's not surprising, if you're in a war zone, you'll find some troops with PTSD. Overall, just less than 3% of these troops probably have PTSD whilst they're in a war zone. But the first group you can see who have good leadership had 1/10 of the rate of PTSD than people who have poor leadership. So you're in the same war zone, the same amount of death and destruction and horror, all that stuff. If your immediate supervisor is looking out for you, doesn't embarrass you in front of unit members, doesn't take on extra duties to make themselves look good, if they are good to you, you have 1/10 of the rate of mental health difficulties. I mean, that's pretty dramatic in my view. This was a study done in Australia, and it was done in firefighters. What they did here was a high-quality study, which is called a randomized control trial, which is where you randomly allocate people to one group or another, which is the best way you can do science for lots of complicated reasons. And what they did is train up some of these fire station managers to have psychologically savvy conversations. For those of you who are well acquainted with fire station firefighter personnel in New South Wales, not the most psychologically minded people you might come across. And so what they did is they trained up these managers and they looked at the sickness absence costs in the 6 months before the intervention and the 6 months afterwards. And because they published it in a UK journal, it was in pounds and not dollars, and they found that every pound invested in that training, it saved £10 in sickness absence in the following 6 months. So again, a 90% reduction in sickness absence costs by having a manager who can have a conversation with you about your mental health. When COVID kicked off here in the UK, I was heavily involved in lots of the mental health support to the NHS, and we realised we needed to train up some of our managers to, again, speak about mental health. If you're an intensive care nurse or doctor, you do incredible work, but your people skills may not be as ideal as you might want. If your patient's ventilated, having a conversation with them can be quite difficult. And what we did is we trained up staff into this model we called REACT, which stands for recognise, engage, actively listen, check for risk, and talk about a specific plan. It was a 1 hour intervention because, as you'll remember, from COVID, everyone was pretty busy. And it involved basically 15 minutes of here's how you have an active listening conversation, a 5-minute demonstration of here's a conversation that would be quite useful, and then we've got people practicing either together or often on Zoom at the time to have these conversations using a simple template. So bite-sized intervention, and what we did is we measured the supervisor's confidence to identify, speak with and support a colleague who's got mental health difficulties. Before the training, over half of them didn't feel confident. 1 month after the training, 85% felt confident. That's from a 1 hour intervention. So I'm not suggesting that's all you should do, but I'm saying that even a small amount of training for supervisors to have those sorts of active listening conversations can have a very dramatic difference. And we know that's the strongest evidence by a long way to improve mental health in any organisation, including at sea. So another recommendation that came out of the review we did was about monitoring staff, about looking at them, particularly those who are vulnerable. Now, there often is, in many industries, not just the maritime industry, a kind of desire to try and screen people. Because if you could identify people who were at risk of developing problems at sea, you could say, look, I'm really sorry, Sandra or Bob, it's probably not the best job for you because we don't want you to go to sea and become unwell. It's not good for you and it's not good for the company that employs you. There is a test called the grandmother test, and that works really well. I'm not sure if you heard of the grandmother test. And the grandmother test is that you've got someone who wants to go to sea because they want to make lots of money. They don't like being in closed spaces. They don't really like the idea of bobbing about on the sea. They've got marital problems. Their kids are unwell, and they know they don't get on with any of the people on the vessel. Yeah, your grandmother could tell you that person's going to have a problem. You wouldn't need a psychiatrist or a psychological test. Your grandmother would be completely right. The problem is your grandmother would also tell you if you went outside in the winter without a coat on, you'd catch a cold, and your grandmother would be wrong in that case. So working out when your grandmother's right or wrong can be quite difficult. Now, I've given this part of the talk probably for over 20 years now, and I always ask the question, who's this bloke? And I think I've probably got 3 people in the whole of that time who's got it right. So I'll ask again, anyone recognise this bloke? Oh, not bad. Wrong, but not bad. It's General Marshall. Marshall, yeah, SLA. So General Marshall was the Chief of Staff of the US Army at the end of the Second World War. And the reason I put his picture up isn't just that I like pictures of elderly generals. He's got far more hair than me. He's far older, but that's another story. So in 1939, if you wanted to join the US Army, you had to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and they determined whether you had true grit or you were made of the right stuff or whatever cheesy phrase. And if you didn't have enough grit, you weren't allowed in. By 1943, they ran out of people. And at the time, General Marshall was Chief of Personnel of the US Army, and he said, we're getting rid of this policy. We're not doing any of this psychological mumbo-jumbo. So all those people who were lacking in grit were conscripted. They were made to join up. And 80% of them went on and had a perfectly good war. They won medals and did whatever soldiers did. And there was plenty of trauma after 1943, that you will remember. So the screening was wrong 4 times in 5. So that's pretty rubbish screening, isn't it? Now, my team at King's College London had been doing military health research for lots and lots of years. We didn't know there was going to be a war in Iraq in 2003. We had no idea. But in 2002, we had gathered a whole lot of data, as we did, and a bunch of military personnel. We had 3,000 personnel fill out questionnaires. And then, lo and behold, the next year there was a war. And 1,614 of those people actually then got deployed and went away to war. I don't know if I've got I have got the data here, so I'll run you through it. So it's perhaps a little bit tedious, but you can see 1,614 people there were deployed. When we screened them before they went, we found 33 people who we would have said, no way, based upon their answers, there's no way we should send these people to war because these people are psychologically vulnerable, they're going to fall apart. However, after the war, only 6 of them still had problems. 27 were doing perfectly okay. And importantly, there were 41 people who we said, they're looking okay, they're doing well, and actually they developed problems. If you add that all together, we were wrong 80% of the time. And we were using modern tests and good sites. And so it's really attractive. It's a lovely idea to screen people, to stop them putting them in vulnerable positions, but it doesn't really work. So that's the first thing, is if you want to screen people to decide who's right to do the job or not, you can't do it. The danger of it is that you will then be falsely reassured that your crew are safe when they're they're not safe. And also it's discriminatory. You're going to say, oh, I'm sorry, you've got this problem, you can't go. Well, actually, that's not really very predictive. Another thing you can do is you can do post-screening. So something bad's happened, maybe the voyage has been difficult, maybe there's been a disaster of some sort, and you can screen people after an event to try and spot who's got problems. And this is regularly used in lots of military forces, particularly the US, who've got obviously the most troops. The US basically been screening for a long time, and they identified that they didn't really know if their screening worked or not, which you'd think they would have worked that beforehand, but they didn't know that. This was during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. But they couldn't, so to do a proper trial, you need a group who gets screening and a group who don't get screening. But the US Congress wouldn't allow them to stop screening their troops, so they couldn't do the trial. Now, that was very good news for us in the UK because we don't screen our troops, but we have the thinking maybe we should do. And so the US decided to give us $3 million. It took a while to get the money, but our team at King's got $3 million from the US so we could carry out a screening trial in our troops, and then that they could use that data. So it ran for over 3 years. There were 9,000 British troops who came back from Afghanistan over lots of times. We used a computer-based screening package that gave advice. Some got the advice, some didn't get the advice. We followed them up 15 months on average later. So big trial, and the answer is it made no difference. So we tried to predict the screening group should have had better mental health. The whole process was to help people if they've got mental health problems, identify them and get to care, and it made no difference. And importantly, this is perhaps rather telling, is the people who got the advice to go and get care actually didn't go and get it any more often than people who they didn't. And this, out of interest, is the only randomised controlled trial of screening that's ever been done on a large scale in occupational settings. So the message here is screening people is a lovely idea if we could do it, but we can't do it. Or at least we can't do it in any way that is valid. It's not going to give you the answers that you want, because obviously, given you're here, you would want to help your staff, but it's not a valid way of doing things. If you are ever going to go down this line, the advice that comes out of the review is it has to be done independently, because no one's going to trust their employer, even if their employer seems nice. You have to use standardised measures. You can't use, do you feel good today? The confidentiality is absolutely key. We did other studies where you do screening confidentially, completely anonymously, and screening where you can identify people. the confidential, anonymous stuff always should get higher scores because people tell the truth. And they have to believe people that if they're screening, they screen positive, that they won't just get taken off the ship and lose their job, because why are you going to answer positively? And even so, when you do all those things, it's still going to be of limited value. And another thing that came out as a recommendation is about having a mentor or buddy system. And one of the papers we did some years ago was looking at what should peer support, what should that look like in a sort of environment. And the 4 things that came out of this study was that peer supporters should be able to listen, they should be able to support in very broad terms, they're not turning peers into psychotherapists or any of that sort of stuff. Should be identify people who need help and help those people get to professional support. And one way, and I have a conflict of interest here because the company I own sells Trim, this is a model, it's not the only model, but just to give you an example, is this process called trauma risk management. So this was a peer group support strategy we started back in the Royal Marines in the late 1990s. It's now used by lots of healthcare trusts, a few maritime companies, but mostly rail emergency services and the like. And the idea is that you train up people who are in the workplace over a couple of days so they have the skills to be able to identify colleagues who have psychological health difficulties. In the short term, they help them, and that's normally by increasing support and decreasing pressure, often involving supervisors and managers. And then if that doesn't work, and they still are unwell after a month or so, then you facilitate those people getting professional help. The Trim practitioner course is 2 days long, there's the initial course, and basically they get taught lots of things, but really how to use this checklist. And this checklist are all risk factors that you can identify through a colleague chat. And if the more the risk factors are present, the more likely it is that someone might have actually a mental health difficulty that needs some sort of intervention. This is important because as well as what we call type 1 traumas, and the type 1 trauma is the ship going down, the death at sea, or some terrible incident. Many environments and maritime environments can be like this, have what we call type 2 trauma. And type 2 trauma is where you have lots of different events that often by themselves are small. It gradually goes downhill over time. And then what happens is something small happens. You decide you're going to move someone's cabin, or you're going to alter their shift pattern, and they go, right, that's it, I've had enough, I'm out of here. And then we'll say, that's a bit of an overreaction. And it isn't an overreaction, it's because they've been going gradually downhill and no one spotted them. And every time they say you have a conversation with someone to ask them how they're doing, you say, how's someone doing? And the answer is normally, I'm fine, isn't it? You know what fine stands for? Which is fucked up, insecure, and neurotic and emotional. So if someone tells you they're fine, you need to be a little bit worried. The real thing there is just because they tell you they're fine, it doesn't mean that they are. They could mean lots of things. When you're training up peer supporters, you don't want them to be therapists. You're just aiming to have someone who's a bit like them, who can have a proper conversation. Just get that. And so the overall impact of peer support is that we absolutely know it helps identify people, it helps support people, and it helps get people who need it to mental health support. There were a whole lot of other recommendations too, if you want to read our paper, and you can see some of them are down to the environment, like noise in cabins, and some of it is much more about sort of recreational activities. But the key thing about these isn't it's just was Neil, me and Samantha Brooks was with a colleague. It's not just our ideas. This is what comes out of the 63 different studies that were in the review papers. The last thing I'll say is be really aware of snake oil salesmen. There are lots and lots of organisations who will sell you what seems like a good intervention, which is absolutely fine because there may be plenty of good interventions. And if you say to them, oh, well, where's the evidence? And they say, oh, here's a testimonial. You know, that's lovely, but testimonials are not good evidence. And really you want to be asking questions about where's the scientific evidence, where's the validity, and if people haven't got anything and they're giving you testimonials, I would be sniffing that you might be finding snake oil. You'll probably want to stay away from that. So in summary, there's often speculation about seafarers' mental health. The evidence suggests that actually there are some modifiable risks out there, which I've mentioned. If you focus on creating psychologically savvy supervisors and supportive teams and helping peer support happen in a workplace, that's a good idea. You shouldn't obviously forget the practical stuff, shift patterns and opportunities for exercise and recreation, communication. They're all important as well. And this is my cheesy phrase to end on, which is that resilience often doesn't lie in individuals. It lies in the bonds between them. And certainly within a maritime environment, there is actually a great potential to have a fantastic bond between the people at sea, but it doesn't just happen. You have to work at it, and there's some things that you can do to make a difference. That's me. I'm happy to finish. What?